Taylor. Trisha's married to Craig, who is my pastor. Craig is a pastor of the Willow Meadows Baptist Church, and Betty and I attend church there. Trisha has been a pastoral counselor all of her adult life. She is one of the top pastoral counselors in the city of Houston. I know a long list of pastors and ministry leaders who have utilized her resources as a counselor. She and Craig have two children. Andrew, who is about to start teaching at Virginia Tech?
University of Virginia.
That's a bad mistake. And then Rebecca, who was a precinct captain at the caucus, at one of the caucuses in Iowa this past week as a young adult. She's getting an education. And and so I hope that if you've not met Tricia, that you'll have a chance to get to know her before the night's over.
And so this is Jim. And Jim and I have worked together for more than 20 years, starting with, I think, when I worked for you, when Jim was the executive director of Union Baptist Association, which was the largest association of Baptist churches in the country at that time, around 500 churches. And so I was a counselor in the counseling center, and he was way up here, but somehow we ended up writing a book together along with our friend Robert called The Leader's Journey that actually 2 weeks ago was just re-released in a second edition, so that was a lot of fun. So we started working together back then. Jim is married to Betty, who is just lovely, and they have a whole adorable story about growing up together and their parents being best friends and like knowing each other since they were born. And so you need to ask about that sometime if you ever get Jim off to the side. They have 5 kids, several grandchildren, 6 grandchildren, including Gavin, who last time we were here, I think we shared with some of you, had been born with a pretty serious heart defect and had had several open heart surgeries, and he is having his first birthday party tomorrow. So that is some of the best stuff that's going on there. And after working together for 25 years, we decided we had been doing this kind of work forever, including working with the RCA forever. I think that's important to say. We started working with the RCA probably about 13 years ago and have worked with multiple RCA churches, have worked with denominational programs, other expressions of the RCA.
Including with our friend Steve Vandermolen, who's somewhere
right
in the room.
There.
Yep, who's back there in the room, yep.
Used to work together really closely on that, and we're currently facilitating the Vision 2020 team with General Synod approaching. So for two Baptists, we love the RCA, and so that's something that you also need to know about us.
So you may have come tonight thinking that we've got these 2 guys who've come in from the outside, and what they're going to do is spend a couple of hours talking about leadership or whatever it is you think we're going to do, and you're going to kind of passively sit there and take the information in. I want you to know that if you came with that expectation, we're not going to meet your expectations. It's going to be a very interactive night. You're going to be up from your tables and posting sticky notes on the wall, and you're going to be having conversations around the table. What I want to do to get us started is to set the stage for like the framing of the work that Tricia and I are doing. And it's going to be the first place where we're going to do something really interactively, because after I say this to you, I'm going to ask you to turn to a partner and say it back in your own words. You understand what I just said? So I'm going to be speaking Korean and you speak Korean, but your partner doesn't. And so you're going to take what I do and just translate it to your partner in your own words. You don't really speak Korean, and I don't either, but that's what you're going to do. I'm going to say it, you're going to say it back in your own words to your partner. And then after we've done that, we're going to pray together. We think that the task that we're working on is an essential task for the health and future of not only Christ Memorial, but of so many churches that we're working with in places across the country. And so to do that, I want to set the stage like this. Here's the way most of us listen. The way we listen is I'm up here talking, And what you've got is you've got this little voice in your head, and that little voice is saying, is that right or is that wrong? Do I agree with that or do I disagree with that? Now, some of you are sitting in the room saying, I don't have a little voice like that. That's the little voice. We just got taught to listen like that, and it's not a bad way to listen, but what we want to invite you to do tonight is to listen from a little bit different perspective. Just every time you hear that right, wrong voice going on, say to it something like this: thank you for sharing. Now, if you'll go sit in the corner, I'm going to just get curious about what they're saying. Well, what if what they're saying is true? What would that mean? What would that mean for me? What would that mean for my family? What would that mean for our church? What would it mean about decisions that we have to make? What we believe is that the work of the Holy Spirit is really, it's invited and it's facilitated when we can take a posture of curiosity. And so I want to invite you to kind of stand in that posture, and let me tell you what our work here is about.
Can I say just a little bit more about listening?
Please.
What we want you to do is just try it on, right? You just try it on like you would try on a coat or a pair of shoes. Just to say, what if some of this might be what God is trying to say to me or to us tonight? What we tend to do is look for things that already go with what we already think, which means that we then get more of the same, right? And so all we want to ask you to do today and tomorrow is just try some things on. That's what I wanted to say.
Great. So, here's what if you've been passive, get active now, because you're going to translate for me in just a minute what I'm about to say. In the last 50 years, give or take, Western culture has lived through a massive transition. There are a lot of different ways that you could name it or call it, but the way we name it is that all of us grew up in a world that was defined by the word Christendom. And what Christendom, all that meant was that we lived in a culture where the church was kind of at the center of the culture. We were connected to the government, we were connected to law enforcement, public schools and the church had really tight relationships. I can remember growing up in a community where everybody, everybody who taught in my public school went to church. And I remember in the 9th grade, Miss Trawick moved into town, and she didn't go to church, and man, she got in trouble because everybody went to church. That's a picture of Christendom, where all of the sectors of society kind of have this Christian view of the world and live out of that view of the world. And depending on how you read history, Christendom began in about 316 AD, and it died somewhere along the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. In the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, the last vestiges of Christendom have gone away, and the church is increasingly being moved to the margins of society. By the government, by the communities, by younger generations. We're increasingly moving out of Christendom. The other thing that's happened is that all of us in the room had our worldview shaped by what would be called the modern world. It would be the Renaissance, that last 500 years, where pretty early on in the Renaissance they begin to say, so the world operates like a machine, and it's a great big machine, but if you can break the machine down to the parts and work on the smallest part to get it fixed, and then put that back in the machine, then the machine works. And that period lasted for about 500 years. And again, it depends on who you read as to when it happened, but somewhere in our lifetime, the modern world died, and postmodernism became the secular philosophy of the world that we live in. Now, here's why that's important. That's important because ministry always happens in a context. So anybody think it'd be a good idea to say to Dave, we got $1 million, we know you feel called to go to do ministry in China, take the $1 million, go over there and build a red brick building with white columns out front and a sign in the front yard that says in English, Sunday school at 9:30, worship at 11 o'clock. We know that's not true, right? We would never do that. What all of us have done for generations is that we've had missionaries learn the culture and learn the language, and then what they do is they plant what we would call an indigenous church. An indigenous church is a church that where the gospel and the culture find one another, and a church that looks like a church for that culture grows up. So we're living in a world where the culture that this church and all of the churches that we know were planted in a context that no longer exists. I just want to pause there. This church and all of the churches that we work with got planted in a context that no longer exists. And so every church that we know that's thriving is a church that is learning new leadership skills for a new context. And in fact, what we want to say to you is we've been working with the discernment team here and some of your elders around and some of your staff around saying there are 3 or 4 essential skills that are different. And we're going to talk tonight about how they're different, that are new skills, that are going to feel uncomfortable to you, that are going to feel like, oh, this can't possibly be good leadership. This is not the way we've done this for 50 years. And what we're saying to you is that if you're going to thrive in the postmodern, post-Christian world, you're going to have to learn some new leadership skills. And what we're here working on tonight and tomorrow is some introduction to some of those leadership skills. Okay, so I talked about 7 or 8 minutes, right? What I want you to do now is turn to a partner. Don't do this as a table. Well, I don't know. Do it as a table. See if collectively as a table, if you can just recreate what I just said. Let me summarize it for you. The context that the church was formed in no longer exists. Post-Christianism, postmodernism have gone away. There's a new context. What is that new context? We're here to learn some new leadership skills that actually help churches thrive in the new context that we exist in. Turn and have that conversation, recreate that at your table.
How do I put this?
How many of you ended up at your table doing the agree-disagree thing, and how many of you translated and let them pray that God would help them to? And then we'll go here. come back in April. Take about one more minute. Did you get a timer?
No, I just turned it off.
So would you wrap those conversations up and come back here, please? Thank you. Some of you immediately come back here if you would. Now, just quickly by show of hands. No shame, no shame. How many of you ended up in the right or wrong, agree or disagree conversation? Anybody do that? A little bit? Okay, good. Yeah. So it's hard. And here's what's really challenging. What's really challenging is I don't know that there's anybody in the room who woke up one morning and said, God, would you please change the whole context that we do ministry in so that our church has to learn a whole new way of doing leadership? Now, nobody did that, but that's what's happened to us. And so a part of there is a work of the Spirit that has to be done for a church to actually take on what we're saying to you and begin to do the hard work of learning how to lead in a new era. And so we want to just ask you to gather up around your table one more time and pray together that God would be our teacher and our guide, that there would be a real spirit of curiosity, that if indeed what we're sharing with you is the truth that God would have you hear, that you'd be open, and that tonight you'd get wisdom and insight and awareness. Just spend some time praying. Some of you are going to pray longer than others, and I'm not going to be able to tell when you're all finished praying. So after a few minutes, I'm going to lead us in a prayer, and then we'll move into the next piece of what we're going to do. Would you pray together around your table? Lord, thank you for Christ Memorial, for all of the people that represents, for the long, rich history, for the marriages and baptisms and mission trips and meaningful experiences that have matured, have called and matured literally hundreds and if not thousands of people over the years. We stand in the rich heritage of people who've suffered and sacrificed, who've given and served, who with vision have done everything that they knew how to do to be faithful to the gospel in the context that they were in. And we celebrate that. We honor that. We give you thanks for that. And we pray, Lord, that in the same way that in another era you planted hope and vision and determination in the hearts of men and women, that in this new era that we live in, that there would be a new iteration of Christ Memorial, that you'd do a new thing here, that there would be a new, that in this new context, that we would, like missionaries in some distant country, that we would figure out how the gospel intersects this postmodern, post-Christian world, and would be faithful to that kind of new church being born and being birthed. We give you thanks that you want to do that, that you're capable of doing that, that your word says that you're faithful to finish what you started. And so we trust all of that. And this evening and the work that we do into your care, help us to be really open and curious so that the Spirit can do the work in us that the Spirit wants to do tonight. Pray all that in the name of Jesus. Amen.
So I want to start by defining a couple of things. One thing I want to define is the word leader, because sometimes we think leader is someone who is in charge of things, right? That's not the definition that we're using when we talk about the leadership at Christ Memorial. I think we're talking more about people who have influence, people who show up, and in showing up, make things happen. Sometimes things behind the scenes. Sometimes you are leaders you lead in ways that never involve getting up in front of anybody or public speaking at all. But you have influence. You have influence with what your face looks like, the expression on your face, the words you say, the relationships you nurture, all of that, you have influence. So some of you are here because you think of yourself as a leader. And some of you are here because somebody asked you to come, and you're not sure why exactly. And so what we want to say to you is that if you are in this room, you are a leader. So that's the first definition. Second definition that I think we want to start with is the definition of the word new. Because sometimes what happens in church is that we hear changing context, that we need to have some new skills, and what we hear is, oh, I know what that means. That means guitar, drums, and praise band, right? Or that means that people can bring coffee in the sanctuary, right? Or that means something that is on the level of the superficial like that. Sorry, but those things are superficial. When we're talking about new, we're not talking about stuff like that. We have no idea what you will decide along those lines. What we're talking about is new in terms of a new way of listening, a new way of thinking, a new way of turning our hearts toward the community around us. We're talking about new in terms of on a much deeper level than making the decision, so are we going to meet, are we going to worship formally or informally? What are we going to wear to church? What kind of music are we going to have? Those are not the kinds of things we're talking about. For tonight, we want to ask you to try on a new way of thinking about church that is also not new at all. How many of you were here for our workshop back in, was that August? How many of you were here for that? Okay, great. We have deliberately tried to not just repeat everything that we did then. We're going to try to take it a step further. If you weren't here before, I think you'll be all right. I think you'll be able to tell what we're doing. But one of the things that we said last time was that systems are complex, connected, and changing. Just think about that for a minute. Systems, and a congregation is a system. All that means is that instead of looking at you as individual believers, who are following Jesus individually, what we're thinking about is, but what happens when you all come together? That forms a system. And we're not just talking about individual people, but we're talking about somehow a collective that starts to take on a mind of its own, that starts to have a life of its own. And we're just calling that a system. And systems are complex. They're complicated. They're connected. Every person in this room is connected somehow, and then you're connected to other people, and they're connected to each other, and they're connected to other people in this room, right? My husband pastored a church once where in the 70s and the 90s, the youth group married each other. Okay, so it happened in the 70s. Everybody in the youth group married each other. And then it happened again in the 90s. So everyone in that church was literally related by blood or marriage. Like if two families had decided to have, a family reunion, we could have had church in the choir loft, right? Because everybody would have been gone. But because we're a church family, we have that same level of connectedness to each other. And then systems are always changing. What's funny about that is the systems resist change, and yet they're always changing, right? So sometimes we think, well, what is it? Are systems resisting change, or are systems changing? Well, the fact that both those things are true is part of what gets us into trouble, right? Because at any given moment, Christ Memorial is both changing and resisting change. And that is happening all the time.
And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. Like sometimes people would say, well, if we're resisting change, there must be something wrong here. There must be something wrong with the people who are resisting. There's nothing, that's just what systems do. They change and they resist change.
Yes, everything we're going to say about systems tonight is not good or bad, it just is. And one of the things that I think encourages me so much is knowing that people in the 20th or 21st century didn't invent the idea of thinking about the church in terms of a system. Because when the Apostle Paul was thinking about how do I explain this thing where you've got individuals, but you've also got something that's somehow greater than the sum of the parts, how do I explain how that works? The analogy that he decided to use was the analogy of the human body. And so what happened here? As he thought about what does it mean to be so complex and yet everything is connected and yet things are changing all the time, what do we know about that I can allude to? He thought about the way our bodies worked, and he said, you are the body of Christ. And so you'll recognize some of these scriptures. I'm going to just read them, and I'm going to ask you to just settle in and pretend like you've never heard them before, because they're familiar, and you have heard them before. But pretend like you haven't. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, in other words, all the things that we think divide us, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Okay, we kind of get that, right? Now, he says, let me give you an example. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it does not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, It would not, for that reason, stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of sight be? Where would the sense of smell be? Sorry about that. But, in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. And if they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. Paul is speaking to this thing that is so hard. How do we take a collection of people, of individuals, who are so different from each other? We differ from each other in so many ways, just like the ear is different from the eye. And yet, at the same time, God asks us to somehow come together and form a whole that is greater than any of the sum of the parts. What I want you to get here is some imagination. That God is saying, I want what happens among you to be as miraculous and as well-functioning as a healthy human body. And so what we're going to do tonight is just think in terms of how can every one of you get out of yourself, your own concerns and your own individual preferences, and get up to the balcony and see Christ Memorial as a whole. That's what we're going to ask you to do tonight. Tomorrow, you're going to look a little more individually, and then we're going to ask you to get back up to the balcony again. But for right now, we want to just give you some systems principles and ask you to interact with them a little bit. You're going to interact at your table, and you're going to use these sticky notes, and we're going to do some different things, so just get ready to be a little bit active. And we're going to start with this system principle, that everyone contributes to the results we are getting. Everyone contributes to the results we are getting. Even me, even you.
And even the results that we don't like.
Well, but if we don't like the results, that's those people
Right,
that are contributing to that, right?
I think one of the things that is important to inject into this conversation is that the old way that we would do leadership is that we call it cause and effect. And so there's a problem, and what we do is we scan the horizon and we say, oh, it's the ear's problem. Oh, no, it's the foot. And if we can just get that fixed, then the body's going to function. And that's a part of the way that we've led. In systems thinking, which is a new way of thinking about leadership, in systems thinking, any results that are being gotten, the good results and the bad results, you're contributing. Now, you're sitting there thinking, what do you mean I'm contributing? I'm not even a part of that ministry. I'm not even in the room when they make those decisions. I want you to think about it like this. You're contributing by what you say. You're also contributing by what you don't say. You're contributing by what you do. You're also contributing by what you don't do. I was thinking about this. Tricia and I were in Chicago last week or 2 weeks ago. We work with a company up there that's doing some work, and there was some conflict in the life of the company. And the CEO was saying, I want feedback from you. And they were saying, well, we give you feedback. And he said, yeah, but, like if I'm about to go running off of a cliff, I don't want you to say, hey, Tricia, you're about to run off of a cliff. He said, I want you to body block me and not let me run off the cliff. If you don't body block me, then you're contributing to the results that we're getting. And so that's a systems principle. So think about some result that you like at Christ Memorial and reach over and pat yourself on the back and say, and I'm contributing to that by what I do or don't do, but what I say or don't say. And then think about a place where we're getting results that you don't like. And be curious about the possibility that you're contributing to that as well, by what you do or don't do, by what you say or don't say.
So this is kind of a funny way to think about it. If you'll go to the next slide, see how long it'll take you to get this. You're not in traffic. You are traffic. Whatever is happening, you're part of it. You may be a tiny part, you may be a substantial or significant part, but you're part of it. So turn to your table and say to your table, everyone contributes to the results we are getting, even me. Just do it. Just
Come on, play with us.
So maybe just a little part of you believes that now. Let's go on to the next thing we want you to grapple with a little bit. If we keep doing what we've been doing, we will keep getting what we've been getting. Can we live with that? Let that sink in for a minute. This is one of those principles that's like gravity. Like you can't change it, right? Just by wishing that were not true. This is one of those things that just is. If we keep doing what we've been doing, we will keep getting what we've been getting. Can we live with that? And if the answer is even partially no, then let's talk about change. And let's talk about how to think differently about change. So here's the first thing I'd like to ask you to do at your tables. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to talk as a group about how has Christ Memorial changed since 1956. Is that the right year? Did I get the year right? 1956? Okay. How has Christ Memorial changed since 1956? I want you to just talk about that for about 3 minutes, and then I'm going to ask each of you to write one thing about how Christ Memorial has changed on a sticky note. So each of you will have a sticky note with one thing on it, and I'll give you further instructions. Okay? Take a minute to answer this question. You're fine. What do you think about a break? Do we need to give them a break?
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, we told them about when we go on a break and if I need to go to the bathroom, just get up and go. If we give them a break, we'll lose 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I just don't say it.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I think.
Adults don't go to the bathroom. There's a couple. At the table, 3 tables back in this aisle right here. She's to the far left. Her husband is next to her right here. They've been a member here for a year.
That's cool. That's good. That's good. Okay, were you able to come up with anything? So we know that everybody needs to stand up occasionally, so this is going to be your chance to stand up. I'd like to ask you to just take your sticky note. Everybody got your sticky note? One thing that has changed? I'm going to ask you to put it below that timeline over there. If it's a change that you can associate with a particular era, put it there. If it's just a general change, then just put it wherever you like. But
So
I'm going to
56 is down here.
56
90 is down here.
to 2020, right here.
2020, yeah.
Okay? So, you ready? And you can look to see what other people put. We're going to let you have a little bit of time for this. One thing. It could be a phrase or a word or not a dissertation. We don't need, bullet points. Okay, go for it. If yours is already written, you can go. Other people might be thinking. That's nice. Hello. Hi. It's so good to see you. Hello. Hi.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, fun. Oh, that's great. Would you be up for just doing a tiny little announcement about that tomorrow? Just saying like, hey, if you want to know more, would you be good with that? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
When did that start happening?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's evolving thing over the years.
So when did you become aware of it?
Well, okay, that's okay. Okay.
Hey, hi. Yes. Uh-huh.
We live south of Lake Jackson.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
I worked for Dow 35 years. That was commission. Yeah, 14 years, then 3 years in Ohio, 2 years. We don't know well because we read that. We're in Texas for 8 years. So we love that.
Oh, yeah. That's really a pretty part of the state. Yeah.
We go back. Yeah.
That's cool. It's good to meet you guys. Yeah. What have you been up there?
Well, we've only been here 8 years,
Okay.
but our kids were here. They went to Hope College in the 80s and 90s. Well, no, mainly the early 90s. And we used to come to church here then. But then the church was so full, we'd have to come 10 minutes early
Just to get a
to
seat.
get a seat. In the
Yeah.
sanctuary, too.
Yeah.
I think that's when Tim Brown was here.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Okay, thank you. So, will that work if you go over there and read some of those? That'd be great. Or hand it off to someone and let them read.
All right. If you hadn't gotten yours up here, bring it on down.
Now's your chance.
So let me read 2 or 3 from each of the 20 years. And before you leave tonight, you might come browse the wall, okay? In the 2020s, some of the things that I see are fewer families with young children, a pastor from Venezuela, Age distribution has tended to older ages. In the 2010s, notice less children in young families. That's up here 2, 3, 4 times. Building updates, growth then loss, diversity awareness, social needs increase. In the 2000s, median age is older. CMC, intimate to business. Changes in membership as a result of not changing enough. In the 1990s, huge growth. Cohesive leadership, cohesiveness, more mission partners, pastoral leadership changes. Looks like the 80s has a lot fewer, vibrantly intergenerational at all levels. Membership has waxed and waned several times, young couples joining, many baptisms. In the 70s, small to large, very inviting to college students. Very attractive to individual young families. It produced significant growth. 3 things in the 60s. More gray hairs, no young families, and growth. 1956, leadership has changed over the years with a different emphasis in mission, changed place of worship, staff, and size, more inclusive, bigger. And that's not all of them, that's just a sampling.
That's just some of them. And so that brings us to another principle of thinking systems, which is this: the past is always present. The past is always with us. All those changes that you identified there are still with us today. The way things used to be, still here. And you may know that we store memories in our brains in layers, so that our pasts are always with us. There's a part of you that is 2 years old, neurologically, right? There's a part of you that's 10. Sometimes you can go back to when you were 16. You may even think sometimes, just being around my parents made me feel like I was 5, right? Because that part of you was still in there. Well, the same is true, just like it's true for our human bodies, it's true for our congregational systems. The past is always present. We never want to say, we've got to leave the past behind and go to the future, because even if we wanted to do that, it's not possible. Systems always contain all of the past that has ever been.
And in fact, as you move to the future, the congregations that are thriving are finding the essential DNA that has defined and identified you, and they find a way to take that DNA forward. It will take on a whole different look and be expressed in a whole different way, but that identity will continue to stay. It's like the 2-year-old and the 12-year-old and the 30-year-old and the 60-year-old. Like, you look at pictures of them and they look really different in all those seasons, and they are different in all those seasons, but essentially the same person is there.
I love the idea of DNA. How many of you have a child who looks like you? Yeah. But are they you? No. And yet, somehow, almost mysteriously, in my family, I look so much like my mother that relatives would often see me and think I was her because they knew her when she was younger, right? We look that much alike. And yet, we're very different people, and yet I carry all that genetic material with me. Very similar to that.
Sorry, can I tell this story?
Sure.
I remember when I was first learning some of what we're trying to convey to you tonight. Tricia just said it a minute ago, you don't ever say, we're going to leave our past behind. I didn't know. It was the very first time I'd been a senior leader. I was at UBA, 500 congregations, a really large association, and we were trying to do some massive change. Did I say I was 35? I was 35. Did I say I was 35? I was really a young guy. I was a really stupid young guy. And in the leading change, we over a decade, went from being a local marketing outlet for national denominational programs and priorities to being a consulting agency. And if I could go back and do that over, the thing that I would go back and do over would be how I dealt with people who had been around in the glory days of UBA, who were 10 or 20 or 30 years older than me. And what I did was when they resisted, I demonized them. I said, you are bad people. You don't love the Lord. You don't want to go to the future. What's wrong with you? Why are you being such obstacles? What I wish I had done and what I've learned to do along the way is to celebrate that past, to honor it for what it is, while at the same time saying, and now we've got to move to the future, because that past is always present.
Would you just take a minute, turn to your table? I'm just going to give you a few minutes. You're going to have to talk fast. But what are some ways that you can see that the past is always present at Christ Memorial? Think of some specific ways that you can see that that is so. A story you could tell there. Do you have a story there?
A ministry story, a church story.
If you've got one.
It's a simple story of when we were at Little Meadows. We were trying to enliven the Sunday school. And there was that hallway upstairs that had 6 classrooms open of it. And what we did was I don't know if this does this or not. What we did was we set up a hospitality center outside in the hallway, thinking people would come, be a lot of life activity. And what we didn't anticipate was that all the introverts were just going to go into their classroom and sit. And now they're in a room by themselves where the extroverts are out following this. And so this change out here changed everything about the dynamics of that.
That works. That works. I imagine.
They could say some of what we're trying to, but I'm not sure they could walk out of the room and say what we're not doing. Like, what's the old deal? I sort of did this while ago, and this may be the place to do it. Tell the story of Little Meadows of in the 70s we had the long-range planning notebook, and then in the 90s we had strategy planning and stuff like that. But the long-range planning notebook was we had all these things we did, and the long-range planning was setting growth goals for all those things we did, and then figuring out what that meant for space and parking. It never occurred to us that what we were doing was not the right thing. We just assumed that what we were doing, and if we worked harder at the things that we had already been doing, make them better, is there a place to do that?
Is that here? Like you thought you were making changes, but you were really just trying to stay the same. Okay, so you've had a minute or two to just think about how is the past always present? Now I want you to put yourself in the picture. So you're going to need another sticky note. And you're going to need to write your name on it. Okay? I want you to write your name on a sticky note.
Write your name on a sticky note. She has such a soft voice.
Okay, so take a sticky note and take a pen and write your name on the sticky note. Some of you are not even moving. Okay, I'll take the ones I can get. All right, and if you would, this time I want you to go put your sticky note above the timeline or on or above the timeline. When did you become involved? When did you join the Christ Memorial family? Okay?
Can I just say I'm new?
Hi. There we go.
We had a problem, a lot of new people at our table. They said, what's this?
Oh, good, good. Okay. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's fine. That's great. So what do you notice? Take a look up there. What do you notice? That's a real question. You can answer it at your tables if you want to. What do you notice? Is anybody over there next to 1956?
Yeah, 2 or 3.
Yeah? Well, there was a cradle roll, so yeah. Okay. What do you notice? Yeah, there's a big middle section there, isn't there? So that's what, like a 2-decade span? A few decades ago. There's a lot over there.
One.
There's one.
1 in 56.
Who's the one? That's great.
Where's Ed?
I love it. Okay. And then a few there around in the 70s?
In the 60s, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
In the 70s, there's about 10 or 12. But in the 80s and 90s, there's a truckload of them.
Big, yeah, there you go. And then there's another little, look, we've got a little tower there
Right.
in the, between 2010 and 2020. Who is in that space between 2010 and 2020? Who's that? Oh, that's awesome. Practically a whole table over here.
And a whole table back there.
That's why you were saying when you asked us how's the past present, we don't know what was the past. So, yeah, that's great. Okay, so this is how Christ Memorial has changed over the years. This is important to notice. It's not just the buildings. It's not just kind of, you had several pastors through those years, but it's this right here. We could do this with everybody that shows up on Sunday morning and ask them to do the same thing. And we would see some trends here. We would see people coming and going at different times. And all of those things, all of those people have shaped what Christ Memorial is today. And here's why that's important. It's not one thing or one person. It's really important to say. Why do you think that's important to say? Somebody answer. Be brave. Why is that important to say? All of this has shaped where we are today. Everything, the really lovely heritage that you have, everything that happens here, the lives that are changed, the worship that happens, all of that is right there, right? And so it's really important to think what has shaped Christ Memorial is not one thing. It's not one person. It's not one person who used to be here or one person who is still here. It's all of us. Remember, systems are complex. They're complicated. We're never shaped by that one pastor or that one thing that happened or that one family that left. All those things help to shape where we are today.
What if I think that's true? What if I think that I and we have been shaped by that one pastor or that one event or that one thing?
So you were shaped by those things,
right,
but you weren't only shaped by those things, right? Our brains don't like complexity. The more complicated it gets, the more our brains just look, just tell me whose fault it is so we can figure that out, fix it, either fix them or get rid of them and move on. Right? That's what our brains want to do. Our brains don't like to think in terms of it's all of this over a period of decades.
And so if I think it's the one thing and we're looking to the future, what I'm likely to do is look back and say, well, so that one thing that made it good back then, if we could just do that one thing going forward, then somehow we could solve whatever the problem we have is. What systems thinking never allows is for that one thing. It is all of that. And in our work, sometimes we'll be talking to people and we'll call that the magic bullet. That one thing is the magic bullet. We just get the right preacher, the right youth pastor. We just get the new building that we need, move the location, remodel the facility. One thing that we could do, that if we could do that thing, then things would be fixed. And when we work on that one thing, what we're doing is we're disavowing this.
Would you just try that on? Because some of you, if we ask you, why have young families left? You're going to name one person or one event that happened. And you're really focused on that one thing. And I want to just be able to come over to you and sit down next to you and say, and it's more than that. And we don't get unstuck until we're all ready to recognize it's all of it. It's everything that has happened since 1956 related to Christ Memorial that has gotten us right here to where we are today. I want to skip the next slide, Dave, and go to the one after that, please. So this is the next thing, is that every change changes everything. This is one of the reasons it gets so complicated, because every change changes everything. Even little changes, right, put things in motion that then lead to bigger changes. Every change changes everything. One of the reasons that we both welcome change and resist change.
So one of the interesting things about mine and Tricia's story is that her husband is pastoring the church that I moved to Houston 35 years ago and served as pastor.
Yeah, there are 500 Baptist churches in Houston, and my husband pastors the church that Jim was pastor at.
And so we're working on revitalizing the young adult ministry, and we've got this hallway that has 3 classes on each side, so 6 classes, Sunday school classes. And we've got 6 great teachers, but what we're thinking is, the young adult ministry needs some more sparkle and pizzazz. The teachers do a great job, but people when they come in, the hallway's kind of dark, and we just need to do something to sparkle it up and make it more attractive to people. And so what we decided to do was, at that point in time, in all 6 classrooms, we had coffee and donuts and stuff in the classroom. And what we decided to do was just one change. We were going to move that out of the classroom into the hallway where people would stop to get their donuts, and there would be some fun, conversation going on, and if I walked in, I would see other people talking, and I would think, oh, this is a fun, warm, inviting place. And we got that. What we didn't anticipate was what the introverts in the room were going to do is they were going to come into the hallway and get their donut and then go sit in a classroom that didn't have anything going on in it with all the energy and activity out here. And that one change that we were doing to make this thing better ultimately had changed some other things in some negative kind of ways. And so every change, and that's just like a really simple little illustration. It's why the magic bullet thing is such a problem, is because you can get the magic bullet, but then that changes this, that changes this, that changes this. And a part of the work we do in systems thinking is we learn to do this.
So when we recognize that every change changes everything, we give up the idea that we can pick one change that will only change things in the direction that we want them to change. We just give that up. We just say that is not possible. So if you give that job to a committee, figure out what's the one change. Sometimes we call that committee like the strategic planning committee. Mm-hmm. Find the one thing that is going to change things and only in the direction that we want them to go. You're going to have to turn loose of that idea, because that is not possible. Every change, the changes we plan on and the changes we don't. One of the things you've experienced is how sometimes you can lose a few young families, right? And then visitors come in and look around and they say, oh, I don't see very many young families. And then you don't see them anymore, right? And just a small change then sets in motion a bunch of other things. The other thing that happens is that we change in order to stay the same. The first pastoral call that my husband got.
Wait, go slow there. That seems like the words, we change in order to stay the same.
We change in order to stay the same. So the first call that my husband got to a church as the lead pastor, he was 30 years old, and I was 29 years old, and we went to this church, and they were really excited to have a new young pastor couple, to take them into the future. And that was really fun until I figured out that we change in order to stay the same. Because what I realized was they hadn't hired Craig, my husband. They had hired Sonny, who had been a pastor 3 pastors previous, He was the pastor at the time that most of the church, it would have been in that period right there, when most of the congregation had joined the church. And they loved Sonny. And he was a young pastor who they hired at about 30 years old, who was a real gregarious, funny guy like Craig is. And we figured out, oh, we thought they were hiring Craig, but who they were really hiring was Sonny. They were making a change. They hired a new young pastor, which is not something, the previous pastor was about the age I am now, so he was not young. And prior to that, we had to go back several decades to get to Sonny. But the church had changed, hired a young new pastor, because they wanted to go back to the days when Sonny had been pastor, back when the church was the way it was when they were mostly in their 30s. You understand the concept of how we change to stay the same?
I think the way that I have experienced that in some conversations here have been, so we recognize that, like it's been very public, even before we came, it's been very public, that the membership and attendance has declined over a multi-year period of time. But you all remember the days when this was happening, and the question that like I bet I've heard 50 people ask is, are you going to teach us some leadership skills that will help us return to the days when there are lots of people coming through the door, where the attendance graph turns around? Is there a way that, is what you're doing going to help us get there? That's exactly the...
We're willing to consider change if it will take us back
Right.
to a time that's really meaningful in our hearts, a time that we loved, and a time that we would like to recreate. So I wonder now if you'll turn to your tables again and talk about how are some ways that either every change changes everything at Christ Memorial, or how have you changed in order to stay the same? See if you can think of some concrete, specific examples. Yeah, but we don't even have to get that far. We can stop. We can skip that. I want to be done. Yeah, we're not going to get that far. I want to be done at 1:45 to pray. Okay. Oh, sure. you going to say something? Were you going to say something? Uh-huh.
Melissa has a multicultural background. She looks a little olive skinned.
Oh, no, I think she's Dutch.
She's what?
I think she's Dutch. I wonder if somebody would be willing to share with all of us, what is a way that every change has changed everything? What is a way that you've thought of? How does every change everything?
Yes, ma'am. Hang on.
One of the things we talked about earlier was the change in the neighborhood, where originally most of the neighborhood went to church here. Well, now the congregation lives all over, and so the young families with when their kids are so young, it's easy to come here. And as the kids get older and they get busier and want to spend time with their friends, then now they're going to change to churches that are closer to their home, which is not here.
That's a great example. Yeah, and all that got set in motion by a lot of forces that aren't even in the church. Yeah, that's great. Did somebody else come up with something different? Be brave.
Does that mean you didn't come up with something different, or does that mean you're not brave enough to tell us what it was? Here you go, thanks.
There was a point when Christ Memorial made a conscious effort to become more multicultural. In doing so, that produced other changes down the line, whether that was how worship was conducted, what things were added or subtracted, possibly changes in the youth program, various things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. What about changing in order to stay the same? What did you come up with?
Now that I've given the microphone to two people, they're really going to be afraid to share.
Here
Yeah,
we
Ray?
go. Yeah.
Something we discussed was there's a feeling of wanting to replicate the warm feeling we had in our hearts back in 1988, 1992 when Tim Brown was here. So if we can find a pastor that replicates him, then we could stay the same. We won't have to change.
That
That was Sonny.
that
was Sonny.
That was your Sonny. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, somebody else. That's a great example. Somebody else.
One of the things we like about Christ Memorial, the gospel has always been the central thing that pulled us together, to put our eyes in focus. The gospel is still that way. Uh-huh. So we've changed to become the same in that area.
So you might present the gospel differently.
Yes.
Based on
Different
lots of different
presenters.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're
It's still
changing
highly important.
in order to stay the same, to keep the centrality of the gospel. Yeah. Thank you. Are the wheels turning? Remember that one of the reasons that we're asking you to remember that every change changes everything is to remember that there's not a magic bullet, that there's not going to be the one thing, right? And that change gets complicated. And one of the reasons we want you to remember that we change in order to stay the same is that God may ask you to change in some ways that are not the same. Right? That don't just, we're comfortable with a certain amount of change if we're going to get a familiar result. But what if we don't get a familiar result? I mean, I look at the book of Acts, and I don't see God mostly taking people back to anything that they had had before. And yet, at the same time, while he's constantly renewing, right, the gospel, right, and taking it to new places, there's both a continuity. Are you hearing me say that? There's both a continuity, and there's some places of really radical change. Like, we're going to do church with what kind of people? I mean, that really is the whole story of the book of Acts, is, wait a minute, we're in, and they were out, but now they're in too?
I often wonder, at what point did Peter look at James and say, this is not what it used to be,
Yeah,
or what I thought it was?
this is not what it used to be. This is not what I thought it would be. And at the same time, when we go in and we read the New Testament, we can see the continuity of what God was doing over centuries, right? It wasn't just a brand new thing. It was a brand new thing that wasn't a brand new thing. God had set those things in motion centuries ago. God set some things in motion right here in 1956. And they were also asked to embrace change on a level that was not comfortable, that didn't take them back to something that was familiar. And I think that's, as someone who kind of likes the familiar and likes to know what's going to happen and be able to manage my world, I have so much admiration for people like Lydia and Paul and all the rest of them, many of them unnamed, who are willing to say, we'll go somewhere new with the gospel. We're willing to do this in a different way if that will bring glory to God and extend the reach of the gospel. Y'all have done this in every generation in this church. You have had to change in ways that were not familiar, that were not comfortable. And it's going to happen again. You understand that the change is coming whether you get on board with it or not, right? Like, systems change. They just do. The things are going to change. I got so tickled one time. I was talking to a couple that had been in my Sunday school class at a previous church. And they hadn't been there in a while, so I called them, what's going on? And they said, well, we're going to a different church. And they named a church in town that was really a different church from our church. And I said, tell me a little bit about what you're doing there. And they said, well, we left your church because things were changing too fast, which I just thought was hilarious. So we'll go to a completely different church, right? Because we don't want to have to change at our church. And I just thought, this is how human beings are. There's nothing wrong with us that we're this way. We just are this way. This is how we behave. So I want to ask you to do one more thing. And this time I think we'll use, what if we use the back window? This time I want you to answer the question, what are some words that describe what Christ Memorial is like? What are some words that describe what Christ Memorial is like? Would you take a minute and write that down on your sticky note? Just one thing. Share with your group. And then once you've shared your answer with your group, let's put those back on that back window. What are some words that describe what Christ Memorial is like?
We start at 9 in the morning?
No, 8. That's a good thing to announce. Okay. And we're gonna quit early. Is that right?
Stop at 1. I think what we ought to do is say we have lunch at 1. If they want to take their lunch with them, if they want or whatever. Is that?
Wait, do we know if it's a box lunch?
Yeah, it's a box.
It's a box lunch.
We
While
don't
they,
have to announce that.
okay. While they do this, maybe, did you just double check that with
Yeah,
Terry?
I
Okay,
was talking to Doug.
okay, all right. So once you've shared with your table, you can go put that on the back window.
On the right-hand side. Thank you.
Okay, for someone who's really desperate.
Share with your table and then put your sticky your sticky note on the window. Please.
This is going to be our last one. I think this will be our last one.
Yeah.
Will your microphone work back there?
Hmm?
Will it work back there?
Yeah, you want me to go read them?
Yeah. Uh-huh. If you haven't put your note up there, go ahead and do that. Okay, Jim,
Yes?
some people might still come and put theirs up there, but go ahead and tell us what you see.
All right. There's a lot of things up here that are something around the idea of being biblically grounded, Bible believing, that kind of thing, biblically based. There's a lot of things up here about being open and accepting and caring and loving. And then there's a judgmental. There's a lot of stuff up here about Christ-centered, mission trips, service, all of that kind of stuff, variety of ministry opportunities, generous focus on worship music, caring groups.
Caring grooves?
Groups, like groups,
Groups.
small
Oh,
groups.
okay.
Small groups.
Got it.
Rich worship, disciplined, musical, giving, generous, older, conflicted, talented, and resourced, all on one
Wow.
page. Welcoming, interested in learning, generous, adrift, dynamic, warm and welcoming, diverse, engaged in the community. Those are the
Yeah.
kinds of things that are up there.
So first of all, great job. There's a lot there, a lot of different layers. Second of all, let's just assume that all of that is true, right? Everybody has a different angle. Everybody has a different perspective. Some of you see some things. Some of you see other things. Some of you say,